Great, good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Erin Corcoran, and I'm the Executive Director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, which is part of the Keough School of Global Affairs. And we really appreciate you all being here today. This event is part of the university's campus-wide observance of Walk the Walk Week. And this year is our 10th annual observance of this week, and it's a week-long series of university, department, and student-sponsored events, helping us to consider how we, both individually and collectively, can take an active role in making Notre Dame more welcoming and more inclusive. Since 2016, Walk the Walk Week is now a cherished campus tradition as we both commemorate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy and renew our own commitment to building the beloved community. Our efforts in this regard flow directly from our Catholic faith and mission as a Catholic university. And in keeping with Catholic social teaching, we strive to live in solidarity with all, particularly the most vulnerable, honor the dignity of every person, treat each person and individual with respect, and build a Notre Dame community in which we all can flourish in. And Walk the Walk Week is an important opportunity among many throughout the year to commit and recommit ourselves to these principles and consider our next steps in building an ever more just and inclusive campus and society. And so this particular event is really exciting for us here at the Kroc Institute, and we've been part of this intentionally for the past several years. And since Dr. Gwen Purfoy joined this faculty here at the Kroc Institute as an assistant professor of racial justice and conflict transformation, she's really taken a leadership role on thinking about this particular event and engaging with individuals both inside the university, but also in the South Bend community and the larger community throughout the United States. And so every year she's invites folks here to be in conversation with and discuss some of the challenging issues that are facing our country today. And so today's lecture is entitled Heal the Land, Addressing U.S. and Global Racism and Anti-Blackness to Chart Pathways to Peace. Racial justice and anti-Blackness are pressing global challenges that demand our attention. And we're excited that you're here to join with us today in an engaging and thought-provoking panel discussion with distinguished experts who will delve into these critical issues. They will explore the far-reaching impacts of systemic, institutional, and organizational racism and uncover the urgent need for change on a worldwide scale. And it's great to have all of you here in person with us today, and we also have made this available through Zoom, so we've got over a dozen people joining us virtually as well. So the structure for this event is that Dr. P will take this opportunity to introduce her distinguished guests, provide you a little bit of background, and then each of the panelists will provide some thoughts for you to consider. And then at the end, we'll open it up for questions and answers. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. All right, thank you all for being here and welcome this is our third one, and we have some new panelists here. So thank you to Kroc Institute, to Dr. Asher Kaufman as well for making this possible for us to do. So I want to begin by introducing our panelists, mostly just in alphabetical order, but starting with gentleman on the end is Dr. Joseph Butler, who's, raise your hand for us, Doctor, is a passionate leader in higher education and a dedicated scholar with a PhD in sociology from Loyola University, Chicago. Go Ramblers. I'm a Rambler, so that's why I say that. His focus on critical race theory and the unique experiences of underrepresented students in academia drives his commitment to creating a welcoming and inclusive environment for all. As an assistant dean for ADI in the humanities and social sciences at Princeton University, Dr. Butler is genuinely devoted to nurturing students' academic journey. He strives to open doors to success, provide transformative mentorship, and ensure holistic support for every student. With a wealth of experience in strategic planning and program development, he works tirelessly to bridge access and equity alongside institutional growth. Dr. Butler is known for his collaborative spirit and thoughtful engagement. He empowers his students by fostering a vibrant and supportive academic community where every student feels valued and inspired. Next to Dr. Butler is Dr. Carla Goar, who is a professor of sociology and the director of the Anti-Racism and Equity Institute at Kent State University. And some of y'all know Kent State's history. Right. Her research uses experimental methodologies to examine the ways that racial power and prestige affect dynamics in small groups. A second area of research addresses issues of adoption and race with in-depth qualitative interviews and structured surveys. A central theme in her research is the examination of the ways in which inequality is negotiated, challenged, and perpetuated by individuals who occupy different spaces in the racial hierarchy. Her work has been supported by the American Sociological Association and the National Science Foundation, and is published in journals such as Sociological Quarterly, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, Social Science and Medicine, and Social Forces. As the director of the Anti-Racism and Equity Institute, Dr. Goar focuses on supporting rigorous and accessible research and creating collaborative opportunities between departments, colleges, and community partners. Dr. Goar's established the Activists and Residents program at Kent State University. They have a great speaker coming up soon with that, and an initiative that integrates academic and community-based activism. This program invites local change makers to campus, which we know is important, providing students and faculty with experiential learning opportunities and real-world perspectives on social justice. By creating this innovative bridge between discovery and action, Dr. Goar hopes to inspire new generations of scholars and practitioners dedicated to equity and systemic change. Next to Dr. Goar is Dr. Amber Hewitt, and she is the District of Columbia government's inaugural Chief Equity Officer and Director of the Mayor's Office of Racial Equity. Dr. Hewitt advises the mayor and senior leadership on policy and budget decisions as she works with agencies to embed racial equity principles into government operations. She's also has her PhD from Loyola University in psychology as well. Her team led the development of the inaugural racial equity strategic plan for the municipality and its 36,000 employees. She is an experienced racial equity trainer and has created metrics to evaluate equity and inclusion initiatives to measure progress towards closing gaps. Dr. Hewitt has also served as Director of Health Equity for a national health advocacy organization and as Health Policy Fellow in the Office of U.S. Senator Cory Booker. She has produced policy recommendations and co-authored policy publications on health equity, social determinants of health, children with medical complexity, and innovative care and payment models. Dr. Hewitt began her career as a tenure-track professor, teaching undergraduate and doctoral level counseling, psychology, and social justice courses at the University of Akron. As a professor, she researched and evaluated preventative interventions to promote adolescent behavioral health and well-being outcomes. And then last but definitely not least, Dr. Greg Wilson is an assistant professor of management, public affairs, and by courtesy, sociology, as well as a faculty affiliate in the Hewitt Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University. And you know, you got to say the Ohio State. And I already know, I know the game was close, you know, and here we are just a week or two after that, and people are feeling a certain type of way. Well, don't take it out on Dr. Will. He just works there.
And I was cheering for Notre Dame anyway.
Yeah. He was a fellow at Notre Dame before, so right. So you know, he's pro Notre Dame. So don't take it out on him. His research agenda examines how and why the human services nonprofit sector is itself is racialized, and how this system impacts the work of nonprofits led by people of color, particularly African Americans. His research has appeared in Nonprofits and Voluntary Sector Quarterly, Perspectives on Public Management and Governance, and Sociology of Race and Ethnicity. He is currently working on a major theoretical article that proposes the existence of a racialized nonprofit industrial complex, RNIC, that articulates the racial structure of the sector and how it disadvantages organizations led by people of color. Dr. Wilson earned a PhD in sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Y'all got a problem there? Okay. He also holds a Master of Arts degree in Social Sciences from the University of Chicago, as well as a Master of Education in Higher Education Administration and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and English, both from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel. So how we're going to do this is I'm going to ask them questions, and they can answer in any form. And then we'll open it up after we get through these questions for the audience. So like if you have a question that comes up, write it down so that you don't forget it. And also people online, if you have a question, you can put it either in the Q&A or the chat, and that'll be communicated to me when we get to that point. So my first question for our wonderful panelists, the only thing is, so one of our topics today is anti-Blackness. So how would you define anti-Blackness, and how might honest conversation about anti-Blackness as manifested in policies, laws, and practices, for example, lead to institutional change? And you can go in any order that you like. Whoever is ready, go forth.
I'll go. First of all, thank you so much for having us. It's always great to be here at Notre Dame and here at this actual event. So when we talk about defining anti-Blackness, as a sociologist, when we talk about, and I think there are several of us up here, when we talk about anti-Blackness, we're talking about a specific form of racism, a racism that dehumanizes, a racism that oppresses targeted people, right? People with Black skin. This goes beyond individual acts of prejudice, and it encompasses structural inequalities. It involves cultural narratives and institutional practices that perpetuate the exploitation of Black people. So when we talk about structural anti-Blackness, we're talking about things like policies and laws and systems. When we talk about cultural anti-Blackness, we're talking about attitudes and narratives that purposefully devalue Blackness while simultaneously glorifying whiteness. I think that's something that we're going to talk about today, that we can't talk about anti-Blackness without talking about whiteness, because that's what anti-Blackness is for. It's something that promotes whiteness. And I think that we do these ideas a disservice when we don't talk about that pairing, when we only talk about one and we don't talk about both. And also, of course, historical legacies. We know that histories of things like slavery, colonialism, segregation, systemic exclusion, these are the things that continue to shape modern inequalities. And we're living in a really interesting time right now. We're living in very interesting racial times where we're getting to see in real time how systemic racism lives in our society and what it looks like and how it moves and evolves. So as race scholars, even though what we're seeing is highly problematic and terrifying, it's also really interesting to see, like, what does racism look like now? How is racism moving? How has it grown? How has it evolved? So I'm really anxious to talk about that. I know we're talking about anti-Blackness, but eventually we'll probably sort of talk about racism more broadly. But yeah, this is a great time to be talking about this topic.
And I can jump in. Thank you, Dr. Goar, for getting us started. I'm happy to be here. I first want to locate myself. I'm a Black cisgender woman from a Christian non-denominational background. Grew up in Northwest Louisiana in the Deep South. My parents who came of age during the Civil Rights Movement. So as mentioned in my bio, I'll be bringing a psychological systems, health equity, and racial equity lens to my remarks. Also want to state that I'm here in my personal capacity, so not as an official of this. of the District of Columbia government or the mayor. So I did want to mention that. So my comments will focus more on the honest conversations and why we need honest conversations. Part of the questions, I think Dr. Goar eloquently stated the definition of anti-Blackness, and I know we'll build on that. And I think we need honest conversations because we need to be truth tellers and we need to be honest and acknowledge the truth about racism. So in my work, working across the 50-something agencies that report to the mayor, we start with developing a shared understanding of what we mean by race, racism, and racial equity, and also just acknowledging the harm done by institutions, by district government, and the federal government, and that role in perpetuating racial inequity. So I think that's a big part of it. And I know we're here honoring MLK Week, and I found a quote that really ties to this concept of truth telling. So he stated that, "I believe that the unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality." So I want to let that simmer as we talk today. So I think that honest conversations about racial equity and honest conversations about anti-Blackness, we have to think about that, as Dr. Goar mentioned, not just at the individual level, but the systems level and how it's baked into laws and policies. And I always start there and we talk about the need to have an equity and inclusion and justice lens in government, again, acknowledging the harm that government played. And I just wanted to list a few examples. Some of this may be familiar, but we're talking about institutional change. So why do we need institutional change? We can talk about laws and policies from the Fugitive Slave Act to more current times, where it was against the law, and enslaved persons were forced to go back to their people that enslaved them. And then also it compels citizens to sort of report enslaved persons who had escaped. So think about that in the context of policies or memos that went out for coworkers to sort of tell on their colleagues who are working in the equity and inclusion space. And some of my colleagues in the federal government have real life experiences of that. Or we can bring it back to sort of a few years ago. So in the healthcare space. So imagine that you have two cars. You have two cars with the same engine problem, but the mechanic's manual tells you to ignore the problem in one car just because of its color. So that is a metaphor that played out in the healthcare arena. There was a test to test for kidney disease, and part of this test was called a race adjustment. So if a person presented as Black or self-identified as Black, it led to delays in diagnosing a kidney disease. So think about how these policies are embedded into systems and leads to actual real world impacts. And that really makes the connection to institutional change. So what's the connection between anti-Blackness and institutional change? Because the honest conversations, yes, we need to acknowledge harm, we need to be truth tellers, but these honest conversations need to lead to policy change and equitable care and treatment.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And first of all, thanks for inviting us here today. It's a real honor to be at Notre Dame to talk about some of these really important issues. And, I want to kind of echo what's already been said about anti-Blackness as being not just kind of an ideological, perspective, but one of that is also deeply structural. And I want to specifically point to my own work around nonprofit organizations to illustrate that a bit more. The nonprofit sector, I'm using nonprofit sector, I'm specifically interested in the human services sector, but I'm using the nonprofit sector idea to refer to that, is often seen as kind of a race neutral space. So if one wants to enter into if one wants to kind of affect change in some way, they go and start a nonprofit organization and they kind of accomplish whatever it is that they're seeking to accomplish. And this kind of prevailing belief around the nonprofit sector creates a challenge with kind of interrogating the kinds of anti-Black sentiments that we've been discussing here today. And so because the nonprofit sector is a haven for anti-Blackness, it's really important for us to kind of like interrogate that space and other spaces as well. And so on this question of how does it sort of lead to institutional changes, specifically in my work in the nonprofit sector, I like to think about addressing these kinds of issues by asking kind of hard questions, not just about like funding, because I think everybody thinks about like racism and funding structures and things like that, but also how do we perceive like Black leaders, and how do those perceptions influence how we interact with them or otherwise think about the work that they're engaged in the nonprofit sector. And so it's really important for us to think about the structural manifestations of anti-Blackness in a variety of sectors. And in my work, I just focus on the nonprofit sector, but it's also visible in other social arenas such as health and government and other things as well.
And again, I am Joseph Butler. Pleasure to be here. I think we all have to share that sentiment. It's always an honor when you have an opportunity where somebody asks you to say something or to share your thoughts. But I think my colleagues have already talked very intentionally about anti-Blackness. For me, I look at most things from the lens of higher education and the academy. And so that's really where my research sits and also where my practice is. And so when I think about anti-Blackness, I think about anti-Blackness being the space where race and racism hide, right? And so when I think about that in the academy, I'm thinking about two words that we use very, very frequently that have no real definition outside of the ways that we manipulate it to isolate a person or to ice them out of a system, right? So I think about merit, right? Meritocracy and achievement. We talk about that all of the time, but we never have a clear standard or bar or metric. I, again, think about the admissions process. We're in admission season. So I think a lot about those conversations that happen. And when we talk about merit, we talk about it differently for Black students specifically. And then even more, we talk about it differently in the context of a white student, right? The same 3.5 GPA, depending on who's wearing it, means something totally different, right? That publication that we argue is so important means something different when it's coming from a Black student versus a white student. And so we have these comparisons and we use these words and these phrases to talk about what merit is, but it's loose definitions that we can manipulate to be able to say why one group doesn't deserve it or merit it and another group does. And I think the other thing that we frequently talk about in the academy is fit. Right? Is a student fit for the program? Do they fit the culture of the department? Right? And we talk about these things in abstract as if people don't have an impact. And what's at the core of a lot of those conversations, when you are honest, is this fear of other. And that other is frequently Black, right? And so that's always one of those things that I am admonishing my colleagues and the folks that are in my network and sphere. We have to think about it. We have to challenge these terms whenever we hear people bring them up, because if we don't have a shared and a collective definition, it's just an opportunity for people to wiggle in and to move around in their own indifference sometimes and hate in other cases.
Great, thank you. I don't really need a mic, but for the people online. All right, so you all point out a variety of things. So as I think about some of the things that you mentioned and how you define it and the need for institutional change, I think about the imaginaries that come along with like who Black people are, but also the spaces that we inhabit, right? And these are how these imaginaries, literature talks about the racialization of space and the spatialization of race and who should be in a place, but also how we respond to particular places, right? So race is spatialized. It's not just, it's attached to the bodies, right? And the imaginaries are attached to the bodies, but it also has a physicality. It has the spatiality as evidence. So how does the failure to acknowledge anti-Blackness sentiments in response to conflicts and crises that are currently going on in the world in places such as Haiti, Ukraine, Syria, and Gaza disrupt efforts to heal, right? And but particularly disrupt efforts for the West to heal in particular from centuries of systemic and historic racism, or does anti-Blackness not even have a part in it? So whoever wants to answer, if all of you do, please help yourself.
We'll have fun with that one. If you don't. So I think to answer the last part first is important. It absolutely has everything to do with it, right? When you look at international conflicts and we look at how the media portrays the conversation of the story, right? The most frustrating thing as both a scholar and a Black man is seeing the news talk about refugees from Africa as this burden on society or this invasive force that's moving into these spaces and taking over environments, right? But then we don't talk about refugees with white skin in the same way. And it really, really demonstrates for us that anti-Blackness not only exists in the Americas, but more broadly. And we also kind of see that when we think about how colorism shows up in a broader sense and context, right? And even when we think about colorism on the international scale, it's hue-based, right? The darker you are, the worse your treatment, or the more criminal you seem, or the more deviant you are. And so again, we use these phrases and terminology to villainize certain groups while we provide language and framing to empathize with other groups, right? And I think war, of course, is wrong and violence across the board is unacceptable. But when we make violence acceptable for one group and unacceptable for another, that's when it becomes a real issue. And most frequently, that right to be able to enact violence on another person's body generally cuts around anti-Blackness. It is far more acceptable to have violence publicly demonstrated against Black bodies than it is any other form in this world. And so it becomes very, very difficult to separate the way we engage in international spaces from the anti-Blackness that permeates our society and our system.
And I think to build on that, something that's coming to mind when I've taught social policy courses is this concept of deservingness, sort of who deserves aid, who deserves our support. And I agree with everything that Dr. Butler said, but let's think about sort of, Haiti versus another country in conflict. Sort of Haiti's crisis is sometimes portrayed as self-inflicted versus the legacy of colonialism and exploitation. And I think that selective empathy, I think Dr. Butler, you alluded to that as well, is problematic. And I think sort of true healing in the West requires a reckoning of how anti-Blackness has shaped international relations.
And I think that I agree with all of that, but I think that the Israeli, sorry, that's a reminder for me. I think the conflict between in Israel is a really important case study in all that was just kind of said. If you watch media coverage of this conflict, of course, it's not a substantive discussion of kind of what's going on. I mean, I would not ever expect that to be present in media, but just the way that the narratives kind of unfold when contrasting the two sides, you always frequently hear Israel has a right to defend itself. You never hear the Palestinians have a right to exist flatly. And the reason why these narratives persist is because they are rooted in a lot of the kinds of anti-Black discourse that we've discussed here today. And so, sociologists have been talking about this for a long time. Anti-Black sentiments are not just manifested in the United States of America. I mean, they manifest themselves around the world in every place that you can kind of imagine. But I think that the Israeli-Gaza conflict is one where this kind of anti-Black manifestation is particularly salient for all to see.
Yeah, I think this question, Gwen, was really tricky, right? Because anti-Blackness is not always the sole or even the most visible factor when it comes to these really complicated conflicts, like the ones we see in Ukraine and Syria and Gaza. But I agree with my colleagues that I think we do see the influence of anti-Blackness, particularly when we compare the treatment of Black majority nations like Haiti with nations like Ukraine. And I remember even when on my own campus at Kent State, after Ukraine after that conflict began, how quickly my colleagues at Kent State mobilized to raise money for scholars in Ukraine, and which was wonderful. That was great. But the silence when scholars in majority Black nations are under threat, the silence from my colleagues there is also very telling. So I do think that, anti-Blackness is something that seeps and it touches everything and it touches all of us. And I know that we're going to be talking about global stuff, but I just want to give a little pitch to some more micro experiences when it comes to anti-Blackness. So I don't do structural work, but I'm a social psychologist. So I do most of my work in a laboratory, and I bring students into a laboratory and I watch them right behind like a two-way mirror. And I bring in mixed race groups of students and I give them tasks to do, and I watch how they interact, and I watch who has power in groups and who has prestige in groups and how that manifests in groups. And so without any sort of intervention, it has been my experience in my laboratories that white students tend to have much more power when working with Black students in groups. And what that means is they talk more, they interrupt more, they make directives. They say things like, you do this, or I'm going to do this. They tend not to use qualifiers. So where Black students will say something like, well, I'm not really sure about this answer, but I think it could be this. White students just say, the answer is this, right? And the white students are no more qualified or no more wise than the Black students, but just the way that sort of power and those racial hierarchies present in the lab, something that's very interesting. So when we talk about anti-Blackness, we can talk about it on a global scale, but we also have to remember that anti-Blackness exists in interactional situations as well. I also do studies on families, on mixed race families, families that are created through adoption. I have done interviews with hundreds of white parents, of children of color, and lots of children who are Black. And the parents talk to me about and they grieve that. And they say things like, I never thought that I would think that about Black people because I have a Black son who I love more than anything and who I would give my life for. And I believe them. I believe that they love their children and would give their life to their children. But anti-Blackness is so strong, right? It seeps into even the most loving and caring interactions in our lives. So I just say that because I know that we're talking about anti-Blackness on a global level, but also it's ubiquitous, it seeps everywhere, and nothing remains untouched.
And it could seep into predominantly Black institutions
Yes.
as well. So I just wanted to mention that.
Right. Well, since you brought up the babies, Dr. Goar, but you got something to say?
I was gonna
Go ahead.
say, right, like, I think,
I'm sorry, I get really excited in these conversations because you don't always get to have them. But I think part of what you all are talking about, right, like in terms of that embedded psychology, right? When we think about human evolution, it's far easier for our brains to feed into negativity. And so then when you give me a boogeyman to place that blame on, it becomes so easy. And for much of global history, the bad guy has been darkness, right? So, yeah.
right, thank you.
Well, just
Go ahead.
to add on to that, so thinking of, not thinking of sort of quote unquote negative emotion, sort of racism typically stems from ingrained feelings around anger, fear, and insecurity. So even the presence of historical facts, as we're mentioning, doesn't always challenge that. So it isn't, doesn't always respond to logic.
You got something else?
Well, yeah, I mean, I want to, I want to make sure that, that we, these kinds of ideological perspectives about race and things like that are really important, but it's really the structural manifestations of it that I really am interested in. And I think in all of the comments, the examples about Haiti, the examples about Ukraine reflect this kind of broader structural sort of perspective that I think can't be lost. I mean, even, we've been talking about, Ukraine is a really, good case study, how you were discussing the mobilization for scholars there from a financial standpoint. I mean, And in contrast to what happens in like a place like Haiti, I mean, the same thing happens with American policymaking with respect to those kinds of places as well. The level of commitment that the United States government has made to Ukraine has been quite remarkable, even more so when you contrast it with a place like Haiti and some of the issues that they have faced, right in our own backyard. And so I think that's really important to not lose sight of.
About the investment in Puerto Rico, which is
I know.
occupied space of America.
I
right?
know.
Like we very rarely respond when hurricanes and other crises hit those spaces, right? And
Mhm.
it says something, and it's not my job to tell you all what it means, but it is your job to explain.
The paper towels weren't enough in Puerto Rico. They were
Right.
tossing the paper.
Right, so thank you all. So you mentioned a few things that lead to the next question. So Dr. Goar, you mentioned the babies, y'all talked about institutions and psychological. So one of the things with racism that is important to talk about is the harm of it. And because it is harmful, it is violent, right? Racism is not warm and fuzzy, right? It don't make you want to hug people other than to try to heal with it as well. So I want to get a little bit into that and into children. So I'm gonna shift gears just a little bit. So prior to 2020, right? 2020, the year of COVID, was also the year of racial justice movements that we haven't seen the like of since really the civil rights era. We saw this, people marching really all over the world after the murder of George Floyd and needing to respond, right, in some sort of way. Because if you're talking about the need for justice, that means that some injustice must be around. But then after, we started seeing all these images because everybody was at home, right? And we're seeing folks marching, and we saw something that was really interesting, which was not only folks in racially diverse communities marching, but we saw a whole lot of white, small communities marching, right? And it freaked people out. Right. I mean, I'm an ethnographer, so I'm always studying patterns and how things shift if you see things. So after 2020, and when things start to settle down, we start seeing this surge of anti-CRT movements. Folks don't even know what CRT is. That's the first thing. But there's an anti-CRT movement, right? And the movement against wokeness, whatever that is supposed to mean. Right? The word of God even tells you to come up out of your sleep. The word of God even tells you that I have you to not be ignorant, right? But the same folks who espouse that they know Jesus and that they know God. And yes, I am an elder of the Pentecostal faith, so I know what I'm talking about when I say that many of these things are antithetical to the word of God and to the principles of Christianity, but people still carry them forth anyway. They can deal with God. I ain't got no heaven or hell to put them in or keep them out of. Right? That's between them and God, right? So, and I was like, okay, what's going on? Like, why all of a sudden we don't want people to be woke, right? Anti-woke, it became a dirty word to be awake. Is it better to be asleep? How can a society function if everybody is asleep, right? If everybody is drowsy and sluggard. Even the Bible also tells you about being a sluggard, right? To get to work, to get things done. But we saw this anti-CRT movement when we started seeing all these laws being passed, anti-CRT. We don't want it taught K through 12. Right? And I'm like, is CRT taught K through 12? Because I didn't know nothing about it. And I'm pretty black, right? I was like, I didn't learn any of it, in school. And then I'm like, anti-wokeness. I was like, I don't get it. Somebody make it make sense. And then so all these new laws that literally prove the theory of CRT, right? That racism is built into the law, right? So let's make a law that say, we don't want our children learning because you want kids, our children will feel guilty and things, right? But at the same time, we know that Black and brown children have never been protected from experiencing racism, whether we do it through tracking and education, over expulsion and suspension rates of Black children, interpersonal racism. We don't even have to go back to the kids who desegregated schools, right? And all the racism that they had to experience, but also being targeted for punishment, which like Victor Rios writes about in Punishment. But the efforts to protect white children from having to think about race or racism while Black and brown children have to live it out, whether they're 1 year old and going to the pediatrician, or they're 5 or they're 15, right? So given this and more, like when we in the United States, We have laws that protect our children because they are a vulnerable population. So when we think about these new laws and initiatives that are not only just racist in nature, but can we also argue that they're a form of state-sponsored child abuse? Now, I know, I just asked y'all something. I know it did, right? Because, what is child abuse, right? It's harm and continual harm upon children. So if you're protecting one set of children from the realities of life, right, while not protecting the other, right? And they're continually experiencing more and more harm through, well, some people say implicit bias, that's a whole separate conversation, right, with it. But how can we discuss this, like these new laws and these initiatives as not only as being racist in nature, but also a form of state-sponsored child abuse? Whoever and whomever, all of whom want to answer that question, go for it. I know it was a lot.
So I think these laws, I always feel so gaslit when I hear these laws, because these laws are, they argue that they're trying to maintain a neutral education experience, right? But that's not true at all. What I would argue is that by restricting discussions that we have with children about systemic racism, about historical injustices, about contemporary racial inequities, that these laws, they simply reinforce the dominant racial hierarchy. That's what they're for. They are to reinforce the dominant racial hierarchy. There's nothing neutral about them at all. Now, I also thought this was a weird question, Gwen. I don't know. I think that state-sponsored child abuse, it feels like a strong claim to me. But I do think that limiting access to accurate, complete education for all children is harmful to those children.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think you talked about what CRT is. So it isn't a set of banned books or a list of DEI professors, as you said. It's a framework. It's a framework for understanding how race is embedded in society. So anti-CRT laws are designed to suppress that knowledge. And that hurts all children, not just Black and brown children. So I couldn't imagine myself growing up. I mentioned growing up in the Deep South. My parents came of age in the Civil Rights Movement. I couldn't imagine not having what we called in psychology positive racial socialization or the development of my critical consciousness. So my parents instilling in me positive messages about what it means to be Black, what it means to be a Black woman. So that's positive racial socialization, because we know that these anti-CRT laws or spaces that invalidate my lived experience and my existence is harmful. And I think that is a connection when we think about abuse. It inflicts psychological and emotional harm. So when it comes to protective factors like positive racial socialization or critical consciousness, which is my ability to not only just go into a room and maybe sense something, but my ability to name and label my experiences of discrimination and racism, and also my belief in my ability to do something about it. We call that self-efficacy. So those are protective factors that Black and brown children need. But I think the important point is that racism hurts everyone. It costs everyone, and it deprives all children with the tools of critical thinking, empathy, and understanding.
So I think it's a very difficult question, of course, but I think the idea for me comes down to, again, I think in institutions and I think in higher ed space, and I think very quickly when we ask this question about, is there violence and harm being done to a student who is at an institution who does not believe they should be there, right? Where every building points to the fact that you're an outlier, right? Where every classroom reminds you that you are one of, right? Where conversations completely disregard your background and your upbringing. That has to do harm, right? And I think about Sue was one of those people who I read a lot when I was working with faculty, doing faculty development and training. And the reason was because Sue talks a lot around microaggressions, and right, like there has been a ton of research in the last 5 years about the actual psychological and physical implications of microaggressions and the harm that they do to the physical body, right? So I can't see it beyond violence, but then drawing it into a much more practical sense, I think about just in November, right, during the election, being in a room full of higher ed professionals from across the country and hearing about colleagues being run off the road in the South and in other places because they have Alpha Kappa Alpha stickers on their cars, because the former vice president was a member of that organization. You cannot separate anti-Blackness from violence, because part of anti-Blackness is a forced location, right? Like it's forcing and subjugating people into a space and into compliance and capitulation. And so for me, when I think about it, it has to be some kind of state sanctioned harm, especially when I think about the way we prosecute different crimes, right? Even in terms of higher education. When a student comes forth and talks about an issue with a faculty member, where that faculty member isn't recognizing their cultural difference and their cultural background, and that student is told by an administrative board that although they do believe that the student is struggling and having issues, they don't believe that it's associated with race because they can't prove it, right? That also does a certain amount of harm. And I personally, having gone through some of those experiences in my own academic journey, it is very real, right? Like I went through bouts of depression and wanting to do self-harm because I looked at myself in my program and I said, did I deserve to be here, right? And that is a very, very real form of violence. But then I also don't want to detach the psychological violence from the physical violence that's also perpetrated against Black lives.
Yeah, and I was just going to just add that it goes without saying, I think, that state-sponsored violence is not new. I mean, so we're not sort of talking about anything unusual. I think what is sort of new and different about it is the boldness of it and the aggressive nature of what's happening in places, like Florida. And I think the other, point that should be made about that is state-sponsored violence, and we talked about this, I think, even before coming out here, while targeted at people of color, the residual effects has major implications for other groups of people, including like poor whites, as an example. And so this is sort of a real thing. I was also thinking about just the sheer harm of restricting what people can like read and how they can understand the world, and how that just the level of harm that has for younger people, particularly when they get into environments where they're forced then to deal with people who come from the places that they have been excluded from thinking about the authentic experiences of these individuals. And so it creates more complexities and challenges for, their socialization and their ability to kind of engage people from different perspectives. And, I'm keep mentioning Florida because I think it's a really important case study for thinking about some of these issues. The governor of Florida is smart in the sense that he recognizes that that state power can be used in service of all of these kinds of aims, and especially in an education context where people are being indoctrinated against the diversity, the mosaic of society that represents all of these kinds of diverse perspectives. And so while this idea of indoctrination has been levied against people who are advocating for difference, it is really these policies that are trying to indoctrinate people to embrace, core beliefs around like white supremacy, which are obviously reinforced through the imposition of these policies.
All right, thank you. So we have time for one more question before we want to open it up for questions from the audience. So let me begin this question with the word of God. I want to read to you from 2 Chronicles 7:14, which says, if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble, notice what I said, as word of God, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. What we learn from that scripture is many things, but what it tells us is that healing is a process, in part that requires some form of active involvement and commitment, right? Whether you healing from a scar, healing from a bad relationship, healing from being fired from a job, healing from sin, right? Whatever your religious beliefs are or not, right? We have institutionalized harm and we have institutionalized violence. That's what we have talked about today. If we don't institutionalize healing our land from racism and anti-Blackness, what do you see as some of the potentially devastating consequences on the horizon for our social world? There y'all go.
So I think I've talked about this. I do a lot of recruitment and a lot of traveling to a lot of different conferences. And one of the conversations that has come up a lot from students who are preparing for graduate education is like, what's happening on your campuses? What are some of the policies and the things that we're instituting to protect students from diverse backgrounds, right? And that becomes a very, very important question. And I think in this context, it's part of what I frequently talk about. It's also part of what I try to talk about in my research is like, what are the things that we can build into the institutional structure that actually safeguard us from our own biases, right? Like those things inside ourselves that we are completely sometimes unconscious of, and then sometimes we are completely ignoring, but that's another story, right? And so one of the things that I think we have to think about in institutionalizing healing is creating space for difference to matter, right? Like I think right now there's a very monolithic view of what a scholar is, right? And it comes from a history of what scholarship has been, but we tell the story of the scholar devoid the limitations to other communities to enter the space, right? So when we think about the academy and its creation and how it has grown and expanded and changed over time, it's all been from this perspective of a cisgender man, white man who has a spouse at home taking care of, right? So you can devote yourself unapologetically to your scholarship in that space and in that context. But then when you think about the nuanced experiences of people of color and the things that they are challenged, even in terms of thinking about faculty members having to exist in white spaces and what that means for them and their lived experience, all of that impacts the ways students are cared for on campus. And we just have not institutionalized practices that value different types of experiences. We in the academy have refused, right? While we are producing scholarships that's causing every other industry to change and to evolve, we're the last adopters of new policies and new ideas. And it has to be the practice of institutions to start incorporating some of the scholarship that's coming out of their departments.
Yeah, I think your response and just the question in general creates, a paradox. Can healing come from the same institution that produces the harm? And I struggle with that, but that's also my work in district government is to promote institutional change, policies change, structural change. I just want to pose that, but what could institutionalized healing look like? So first, it could look like a shift in power dynamics, a commitment to restorative justice, shared decision-making. We talk a lot about promoting more equitable outcomes, but there's also a process to that. And part of that process is lifting up the humanity lived experiences of those who have been most harmed by unjust policies and practices. And it also involves truth telling. So we can't heal without telling the truth. We've seen this model globally. We've seen it also modeled here in the US. the city of Evanston, as well as the state of California, and different truth and reconciliations, reparations task forces. But back to the consequences, because I think I'm just resonating, Dr. Butler, what you said around just the anxiety and stress. And I have felt that deeply over the past couple of weeks. So you touched on some of the psychological as well as emotional costs that racism causes: stress, anxiety, trauma. We need culturally competent mental health care that recognizes and acknowledges racial trauma. I touched on some of the healthcare impacts. What about the economic costs? So the loss of productivity due to a less diverse workforce, as well as the political and institutional cost, the weakened democracy caused by less trust in government. So the consequences are deep and wide, and I think it's not just individual, but it also is impacting our progress as a society.
So yeah, I agree with what my colleagues have said. I do think that if we fail to heal from racism, that will just exacerbate these existing inequalities. So I want to just give a little plug, because I think that the Anti-Racism Equity Institute at Kent State is trying to think about innovative ways to heal from racism. And so last year we had an activist in residence. Her name was Jasmine Long. She was the president of a group, a nonprofit group called Birthing Beautiful Communities. This is a nonprofit group of Black doulas, and they work with the women in Ohio. Black women in Ohio are 3 times more likely to die during the perinatal period, 3 times more likely to die during the perinatal period. But when they have a Black doula on their birth team, that disparity, it just vanishes, right? There's something about having culturally responsive care on your birth team that creates an inequality, right, of the birthing of the birthing experience for Black women. And so we had Jasmine on our campus 3 times last spring. She met with faculty, nursing faculty, public health faculty. She spent lots of time with students, and that's really important because students are emerging leaders. And the students got to meet her and talk with her and understand, how does activism work? How do you take a problem and figure out viable, sustainable solutions? And we even have students who are interested in going through the doula training program. And we're in talks at how we can support that as they move forward. So I think that there are things that can be done, particularly on the local level. I think that universities are the perfect mechanism to do this. And, you know, universities have lots of problems. We all know, because we are products of the university. But universities are also, they are wonderful mechanisms of transformation, of discovery, of change. And I used to always think about universities as these like big, huge, bumbling things until COVID, until I saw Kent State like shift on a dime within a week. We closed down during COVID in March, like I think March 6th. By March 9th, we were 100% online, right? We had all these faculty, we did all this training, and we were nimble in a way that I never thought the university could be. And ever since that experience, I think of the university in a very different way now. And I think the universities can lead when it comes to issues of anti-racism. I'm really excited about the program at Kent State. I'm really excited about the program here at Notre Dame, and the commitment to anti-racist work. So I think that we should encourage our institutions to lead in this regard.
I agree. And if you need an example, another example is what happened at Syracuse University and Rutgers University and now Hunter College under the leadership of Nancy Cantor, who has really leveraged the considerable reach and resources of the university to address a lot of the issues that we've kind of talked about today. I would just end this discussion, maybe if somebody may have something else to say, by simply emphasizing that healing is a very difficult process, which is why it often doesn't kind of ensue. And I firmly believe that institutions of higher education can and must play a leading role in that. When I was coming to Notre Dame, I was being driven here, and I've never driven around South Bend, but the driver who was driving the Uber was kind of giving me the lay of the land in South Bend. And his comments about some areas, I don't know the geographical parts because I'm not from here, but his emphasis on how the Black communities in South Bend, were dilapidated, were in kind of bad shape, and all of these things kind of struck me because South Bend, and this is probably going to sound controversial, but I have to say it. The University of Notre Dame has a fundamental responsibility, I think, to lift up the community of South Bend, especially the parts of this city that are inhabited by people of color, especially African Americans. I was so astonished by what I saw, the level of poverty in this city that I saw driving in from the airport reminded me of some places that I've been in other parts of the United States, like in particular in Alabama, where the resources aren't nearly as immense. And so I think all I could think about was how ashamed I would be if I were a university with such immense power and immense resources to have this beautiful campus in the backdrop of a city with such glaring racial disparities, with such profoundly dilapidated housing and infrastructure. It's really a remarkable thing. And so one of the things that I hope we take away, I'm sorry for being controversial about this, but one of the things that I hope we will take away from this is that the University of Notre Dame has a fundamental responsibility, I think, to intervene right here in South Bend. You don't even have to go to Indianapolis. You can go right by the airport and intervene and make a difference to heal the communities that are right here in South Bend.
All right. So we have time, we have a good amount of time for questions from the audience who are in person, but also those who are online. If you raise your hand, our executive director will bring the mic towards you.
You want to go first? And when I hand you the mic, if you could just maybe say your name and introduce yourself to the panelists, that'd be great.
I'm Asher Kaufman. I'm the director of the Kroc Institute. Great to have you all here with us, and thank you, Gwendolyn, for organizing this panel. I have had many questions along the way. I'll ask two. One about the global context. You mentioned a few areas of conflict zone, and I immediately thought about others, such as Ethiopia, the civil war in Ethiopia. It's Black Ethiopians killing Black Ethiopians, or Darfur, which is again, so there are plenty of global areas of extreme violence, and I wonder if you can reflect on these sites where the racial issue is less explicit, but the violence is still extreme, and can you actually bring in anti-Blackness to the lands to these areas, these places of conflict? The other question that I have is about here, the United States, domestically. In the 1990s, there was this thinking about the major demographic shift that is happening in the United States, that eventually it will just fix things because demographically the country is becoming heterogeneous, and predominant white population is decreasing in numbers, and that will fix things. Clearly, we are now in 2025, and we are seeing the reverse. I mean, the heterogeneity of the American society is clearly happening, but it is not translated into a shift in racial reality. I wonder if you can reflect on that with us.
Well, while they're reflecting, one of the things I want to say is the thing is like we can't get away from the anti-Blackness of colonialism and the long-term impact across centuries. That if you think of even Ernesto Verheul's work, and we think of Rwanda and places on the African continent, the invasion of the African continent is not separate from the anti-Blackness and how it disrupted cultures and places. But most crimes, most violence often does happen right within the group that you're in, right? White on white, black on black, Latino, Asian Americans, people are segregated in many different ways. But a lot of the conflicts that we see in areas that have been colonized or near areas that colonized, we can't extract it from the anti-Blackness and the consequences economically, psychologically, and culturally on that as well. So I just want to add that to it.
I was gonna say, like, Frederick Douglass says, power concedes nothing, right? And I think that's what we are, power concedes nothing without struggle, right? Like, that's the end of it. But I think that's what's happening in America, right? Is white Americans see themselves disappearing. And so there is this backlash and reaction to it, right? And I think coupled with that reality, we also have to honestly engage with and think about, I think, Gwen, what you're talking about. I think the first time where I was introduced to this, there was a papal edict in 1493 that declared that any nation that was not a Christian nation should be conquered and the savages brought under submission, right? In that moment, it was the beginning of the expansion period, right? Where this Eurocentric ideology permeated the globe. And we are witnessing the consequences thereof every day, right? And I think when we talk about conflict in spaces like a war, areas in Africa that are war torn, it is because of a nation having been bled of its resources and also inundated with new populations that traditionally hadn't inhabited the space. So the land can no longer sustain the people, so there's conflict, right? And so I think a lot about those realities. And again, jumping back to this larger idea about power conceding nothing, what we also have to acknowledge and think about that moment in the 90s when we started to talk about the white population dissipating. We also have to recognize and realize that that's when we started having honorary whites, right? People who could fill in the void and the gap and speak to some of the colonization and the oppression and the systemic and institutional issues and reinforce them with the promise of being declared white, which we haven't actually seen ethnic groups become white in some time. And so these temporary or honorary white positionalities have actually fueled a lot of the conflict and the fights that we see now in American context, because it is the resistance to fading away in a lot of ways.
All right, next question.
Hi, my name is Ade. I'm a PhD student here at Kroc. It's so nice to meet all of you, and thank you so much for your presentation. I do have 3 variant questions, so pardon me. So my first question is related to something that Dr. Hewitt sort of hinted at very, very slightly in the middle of the conversation, sort of on internalized racism and sort of the I think sometimes this conversation is also complicated because oftentimes individuals within these groups that we're talking about oftentimes don't realize that they've internalized some of this. And because they're facing so much attack from the external, individuals are not really examining how it's impacting them internally, but also how it's impacting how they view other Black people. And so, the relations between African individuals in the diaspora versus African American individuals here. The relationship is very fraught, and you will see a lot of tension then, and that tension, can be arguably tied back to sort of that internalized racism that appears. And so I'm wondering if you all can talk more about that too, because I know we're talking all about the white perspective on racism, but then there's also this internalized stuff that's happening amongst those communities. And I'm also wondering about epistemic racism. Dr. Butler, you've done a fantastic job of talking about the academic side of things, but the perspective that what Fanon talks about knowledge that comes from the zone of being, being automatically prioritized in this way over knowledge that comes from the zone of what he would call non-being. And so that means that somebody who's saying something from the global South, kind of the examples you all were giving, is automatically seen as less valid, less everything. And so I'm wondering about those things too, and how those epistemic racism is also tied to sort of what you all have been talking about in your various areas. And my last question is sort of related to what Dr. Wilson talked about, hopefully I'm saying your name right, about you sort of confronted a serious tension between Notre Dame and the South Bend community. And after being a student here, I have two of my directors here, so I will cover my face while I say this. After being here for like 3 years, there is this sort of token effort done by the university in order to sort of address your comments. And those efforts are sort of, every time the critique of the university comes about, there is this effort of like, oh, we did this. So that's, you know, what more do you want from us sort of situation. And so what you have is a situation where there's harm there. There is people on both sides, the South Bend community, Black community, the indigenous community here are saying that there is harm and both sides are acknowledging it. But the sort of reparations of that harm is sort of done in a way that benefits Notre Dame, I guess. That's how I would put it. And so it's lacking in like sustenance. It's lacking. And I'm not really sure how you all are thinking about those kind of situations where people are addressing it to their own benefit. And I see this oftentimes with the DEI initiatives that came out during 2020. People addressed certain things, but only to their own benefit and to the extent that it would benefit their company, university, and spaces. So I'm wondering how you're sort of thinking about those things in your own conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for those questions. And we didn't get to go in depth on internalized racism. And I think that speaks to those protective factors and why they're so important. So positive racial socialization or socialization across different social identities, being able to sort of deconstruct what it means to be in your body and spaces and what that means. And my research, I left the academy like 8 years ago. So I haven't done research in a long time, but it touched on internalized racism, specifically the endorsement of negative Black stereotypes among Black young men. And we saw that a higher degree of endorsement of stereotypes had a strong correlation with poor self-esteem, poor collective self-esteem, and lower academic outcomes. And the inverse of that for a lower endorsement of those stereotypes and a greater endorsement of critical consciousness. So I think it's really important. And a question I often received in coming to this role, you know, DC, you may know it by the nickname Chocolate City. Black population has declined in the past couple of decades, but why do we need a racial equity officer in DC? Or even amongst my colleagues who are heads of agencies? Well, my staff is predominantly Black. Why do we need to focus on racial equity? Well, racial inequities still exist. If we look at the data disaggregated by race ethnicity, we see there are inequities. So it isn't just about who's in power or even intentions. Who cares about good intentions? It's not enough. So we have tools to analyze policies to ensure that we're incorporating the lived experiences of those who are most impacted and that we aren't perpetuating racial inequities. I'm happy to go more into detail to that, but you know, if you Google racial equity impact assessment, you'll see the set of questions that you can ask when you want to analyze a policy or program from an equity or racial equity lens.
I'll just go back to what I was talking about, you know, earlier, and you know, I'm not here to take the university to task, or maybe I am. But I think if you love Notre Dame, you should love it enough to tell the truth. And the truth is that it is in a space that does not reflect the best of like the university, with what we understand the university to be. And so, while of course it is true that, as you pointed out, and I don't live here, so I'm not as familiar with all of the initiatives that the university is sort of taking within marginalized communities. And I'm sure that there are some efforts, but there are a number of other areas that I think the university should really think carefully about in terms of using its immense resources. And I'm not just talking about like its financial resources. I mean, it's one of the best universities in the world in every field of human endeavor that could have positive implications for improving the educational outcomes of students who are in public schools within the South Bend community, to helping think about how to alleviate the multidimensional nature of poverty that affects so many people in the city that I just saw with my own eyes, to help facilitate, better physical and mental health outcomes. And so all those people who love the University of Notre Dame should love it enough to tell the truth about its role in the maintenance of these kinds of issues, but should want it to do better, essentially. And it's not just the University of Notre Dame. I mean, there are so many other places. I graduated with my PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Madison, Wisconsin is home to some of the greatest racial disparities in the United States of America. And the university has been responsible in the perpetuation of many of those kinds of disparities. Columbus, Ohio, the same thing. Universities, with their immense resources, both material and social resources, have I think a fundamental responsibility, more than an opportunity. They have a responsibility to intervene in the places in which they have been welcomed. And I just don't think that we often take those things seriously, but we should hold our institutions to account to live up to these fundamental standards.
I think, right, like, I am consistently living my research, and so I dance between the academic jargon and lay speak, right? But I think in terms of my research, if you look at how I examine the institution, it's that idea of shock that I explore the most, right? When students get to institutions and recognize that the space wasn't designed for them, what they experience and what they go through. And part of what I have discovered in my research is just what you're talking about. Is like, there is a refusal to accept the creation of knowledge that rises from culture, right? You have a few institutions that do it through various partnerships with community. But even in terms of how that scholarship occurs, it's policed by the institutions, right? And I think that's part of what you're alluding to in terms of how we choose to engage with the broader public. And I think the thing that matters, and I like to think about, is like, yes, we as scholars, right? Like, you are getting ready to get your PhD. I'm a newly minted PhD, right? I graduated in May, correct? So thinking about what you get to do as a scholar and as a practitioner, you get to change the narrative. You have the opportunity to set standards, and you have the opportunity to create knowledge. And I would be remiss if I did not address the internal conflict that you're talking about, right? The conflict that exists between the Black community, which I will say in this space, I do not normally have these conversations in mixed company, but what I will say in this context is two different groups of people miseducated about one another simultaneously, right? That's the case, and that's the conflict, right? You have a lot of different things that go into that, but the real conflict is Americans were taught one thing about themselves and about the continent, and then the continent was taught one thing about themselves and about African Americans, and that created the conflict, right? And we have to be very, very clear about that, because the only way to dismantle it is to have an open mind and an open line of communication between us to be able to talk about where the power is.
Hello, my name is Tiffany Russell, and I work at the Counseling Center here on campus. I'm also the president of an employee resource group, Black Faculty Staff Association. And I think it was Dr. Goar, you had the phrase you used about anti-Blackness seeping in everywhere, I think is how you framed it. And I'm just curious for all of you, I guess, in terms of being Black and doing work like this, how do you navigate the challenge that comes with living through the challenges that anti-Blackness gives us as Black people, right? Like if it is, I so love the way you said it seeps into everywhere. And so that means we're impacted by it as Black people. And so you all and your commitment to this work, I'm curious how you navigate the challenge of that. And then also, how do you find support being a Black person working and being committed to anti-Blackness?
That's
Well,
so
well,
hard.
I'll let y'all ponder, and I'll begin the response while they breathe with it. So, well, it's work, right? And so one of the things is to protect your peace. And as I said earlier, racism is spatialized. So sometimes you have to extract yourself out of racist spaces, which can include where you work. At the same time, and not being afraid of the consequences of doing so, because if you are going to, I don't like to use the word resilience, but if you're going to persist, you have to do what it takes for you to persist and to do it unapologetically and unafraid, and knowing that, yeah, it might come with some cost, but you either going to pay with the cost of your peace or you're going to conform, right? So I think that's an important thing to do, because it does seep in everywhere, and knowing those spaces because spaces themselves can be violent without people even being in those spaces, right? By designs of those spaces where places are. Like I tell students, like honors hallways are usually racist. Like why? I said, because when you look in the doors, you don't see nothing but white folks, right? As you go through. So I think that's one of the challenges as well. And then finding your community and being someone wrote a piece a few years back of the importance of Black people having non-white spaces and that they could just be in, right? Or like Latinos having it, or Asian Americans. And I remember I used to have my students read it and they were just like, isn't that racist to do so? And I just gave them a look, right? For it. And you gotta ask the question, okay, like why do you need to be in this space? Why do you not see the understanding of it, right? And making people feel guilty because they need to step away from where the harm is happening. You can either continue to place yourself because, as Dr. Butler said, because of the culture of the space, like you have to do things this way, you have to do, but a lot of that comes from a white racial frame. And to constantly just put yourself in harm in those space, like in those opportunities that we actually can have control over, but also getting to a point where you don't need to explain yourself to people, because that's also a tool of superiority and power to make certain groups need to explain why they're sitting together in the cafeteria, right? There's a book on that, right? And so like really understand that and realize like that's the world that you're in, and being okay with it. Yeah, so that's just part of the answer. I don't want to say anymore because I'll talk an hour on it. So I want the panelists to get to address.
I mean, I'll be very brief. I mean, similarly, affirming spaces, and I think also sometimes being in spaces that don't validate your humanity or existence can have you questioning your sanity. So I think a question I tell myself, well, a phrase I often say to myself is, and we all know this, systems are designed to maintain the status quo. And that's why I'm here, and I have the tools to help dismantle parts of the system. I have to remind myself of that, because sometimes I'm like questioning, is this real? And Dr. Goar, you mentioned feeling gaslit, and that's very real. So that's similar. I just wanted to add that my self-talk.
I would encourage you to get a personal board of directors for your life. So I have a board of directors. I have 6 Black women who are my board of directors, and these are people that are always on my side. They're always honest with me, right? So if I've done something wrong or made a mistake, they'll say you made a mistake, but we're still always on your side. They always promote, they always support. And they will listen and reflect, and I can talk to them, and they can and they give me good feedback, and that's very, very helpful to have my board, right? So whenever something goes wrong, I'll call a meeting. And it's so wonderful to have that kind of support. So I encourage you to do that. And also there are important things you can do to have places. You know, Gwen mentioned places of peace. So Gwen and I met at Kent State. She was a professor at Kent State before she came here. And she would invite me over and we would have lunch on Sunday afternoons because she's a great cook, first of all. And she would invite me over and I would stay over all afternoon and just eat and talk and laugh. And I'd cuss and she'd always get mad because she doesn't like, you know, when I cuss, but I would a little bit. And we just had the most fun time. And I would leave her house and I would feel ready for the week. Like I knew like this is going to be a good week. We just had so much fun. You know, we talked all this mess about all our colleagues and I could kind of get it out. And these are really, and it was more than just having lunch with a friend. It was so much more than that. It was about being in a safe place. It was about being my authentic self and not having to pretend and not having to edit. Those are really important times. So I encourage you to get a board of directors and also to have people in your life that will accept you as you are, that can spend time with you in a safe place where you can just really relax. And that is so affirming.
I will say that it's okay to break, right? Like I was literally sharing with the panel this morning, like the other day, I could not get myself out of the bed, right? Like I consider myself both a diversity practitioner and a diversity scholar. And both have been under full siege for a long time. And it has just been ramped up in the last few weeks. And so it becomes overwhelming, right? Because for me personally, I can't ignore the news because it impacts the work that I do on a daily basis and I have to be aware. And so I have to be attached to it. And so you have to have moments and spaces. The board, that's amazing. I must establish my board. I right now just have my friends there, my besties, my loved ones who hold me up in that way. But I like that setup. But I think you have to remember that it's okay to break. Like you don't always have, and you don't always have to, right? It is okay. We are human and it's hard. Life is hard. And doing life as a Black person fully embodied is that much more difficult in this space and in this moment. And you have to be okay with the fact that sometimes I have to check out, right? I cannot be on. And anything you're expecting from me today, push it, right? And we have to, I think Black people especially, we frequently are trying to be overachievers, but it is okay to not be okay. And I think that's one of the things that I've really gotten into. And I will just say, like, the way I make it in these moments is in important moments, you're gonna find Joseph in his dashiki, right? I was born in Chicago, born and raised, but you're gonna find me in a dashiki when I have an opportunity where I feel like I can fully express myself, right? Or in a moment of extreme importance, when my colleagues are in suits and ties, I'm not doing it, right? Like that's not my standard of professionalism. And I will say the pandemic was also extremely helpful for me because it's when I decided I was gonna grow out my facial hair and my hair, right? Because I spent so much time having people police how I look that I decided that my intelligence is not determined by what's on my hands. So, yeah. Dr. Wilson, before we wrap up?
I mean, you know, the interesting thing is that I actually have not carefully thought about how to develop those kinds of safe spaces or context that helped lift me up. And so I actually learned something from the three panelists in terms of thinking about how to kind of make sure that I'm okay in the context of doing this work. So thank you all for that.
Okay, fortunately, we're out of time. So you might have to talk to us like one-on-one. I'm like, I don't know, do we want to take one more question? But I do want to just mention something that someone put online. That this is from Dr. Kelly Moore that noted that, she said, thank you very much for all your contributions. And given the attacks, and this is something we all can think about and provide answers for ourselves of, given the attacks on DEI, particularly in public schools, white faculty have a major responsibility, indeed opportunity, to address anti-Blackness in new ways. And she noted that her colleagues and her have been discussing these new methods, and she's eager, she's a white woman, eager to hear from the panel, and maybe we can talk about it over dinner, and I can send her an answer about what we'd like to see from white faculty, given these new circumstances. And she said, thank you. So I wanted to read that out loud. In honor. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to Croc, to Dr. Kaufman, to Aaron Copeland, and to Ari, and to Kate, and to Jenna for all your help in making this happen. Thank you so much. And those who attended online, thank you.